For most of 1943, American bomber gunners were trained to do one thing above all else: wait. Wait for the enemy to get closer. Wait for the perfect firing range. Wait for the textbook moment. That waiting was killing them. Hundreds of bombers went down over Europe while gunners followed the rules exactly as they were taught. The experts insisted the doctrine was sound, the mathematics were correct, the training was proven. But one teenage tail gunner noticed something the manuals ignored. His gun sight was damaged. His shots weren't supposed to work. And yet, the moment he broke the rules, everything changed. German fighters hesitated. Attack formations collapsed, and bombers started coming home. This is the story of how a broken sight, a forbidden decision, and one underestimated gunner exposed a deadly mistake and quietly saved hundreds of lives in the skies over Europe. If you enjoyed true World War II stories about forgotten heroes and the moments that quietly changed history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. These are the stories that don't always make it into textbooks, but they shaped the war. By the middle of 1943, something was deeply wrong in the skies over Europe. On paper, the American bomber force was one of the most heavily armed formations ever created. Each bomber carried multiple machine guns, overlapping fields of fire, and a crew trained to defend the aircraft from every angle. The theory was simple: concentration of firepower would protect the formation. Bombers would shoot their way to the target and back. In reality, they were being slaughtered. Week after week, bomber formations crossed the channel and failed to return intact. Aircraft vanished from the sky. Crews burned inside aluminum shells. Parachutes either never opened or opened too late. Loss reports piled up faster than replacements could arrive. Commanders tried to rationalize the losses. Weather, flak, enemy skill, bad luck. But the numbers told a different story. In some periods of 1943, bomber groups were losing more than 10% of their aircraft per mission. That number was not survivable. At that rate, a crew's chances of completing a full combat tour were little better than a coin flip. Entire squadrons were mathematically doomed before the war could be won. And yet, the training manuals remained unchanged. The doctrine was clear and unambiguous. Defensive gunners were instructed to hold their fire. Do not shoot too early. Do not waste ammunition. Wait until the enemy fighter reached the prescribed range. Engage only when the probability of a hit justified the expenditure. The logic seemed sound in classrooms and briefing rooms. Ballistics tables supported it. Training films reinforced it. Instructors repeated it until it became instinct. But combat did not care about instinct. German fighter pilots had learned exactly how the system worked. They knew the range at which bomber gunners were taught to fire. They knew the moment when defensive guns would finally open up. And they exploited that delay with ruthless efficiency. Attack runs were carefully timed. Fighters approached fast, stabilized briefly, fired first, and broke away before the defensive fire became truly effective. The initiative belonged entirely to the attacker. Every second the gunners waited was a second the bomber absorbed damage. The contradiction was obvious to those who survived long enough to notice it. But noticing a problem and changing doctrine were two very different things. The Army Air Forces had invested enormous resources into training. Hundreds of thousands of gunners had been taught the same principles, drilled on the same ranges, tested on the same procedures. To admit the doctrine was wrong was to admit that the institution itself had failed. Institutions resist that kind of admission. So instead, losses were normalized. Casualties were categorized. Replacement schedules were adjusted. The system absorbed the dead and continued forward unchanged. What made the situation even more dangerous was that the bombers themselves were not the weak link. Engineers had done their jobs well. The aircraft were rugged, redundant, and heavily armed. When everything worked as designed, bombers could survive astonishing punishment. But the defensive system depended on timing, and the timing was wrong. Every engagement followed the same pattern. Enemy fighters assembled at distance, out of effective defensive range. They chose their angles, adjusted their spacing, and began their dives. The gunners watched them come in, fingers tense on the triggers, waiting for permission that would never arrive. By the time firing began, the enemy was already inside his own optimal range. This was not a problem of courage. Bomber crews did not lack bravery. They stayed at their posts even as aircraft disintegrated around them. They continued firing while wounded, while freezing, while suffocating at altitude. The problem was structural. The doctrine assumed a calm, controlled environment. It assumed stable platforms, clear visibility, and predictable motion. It assumed that combat would resemble training. Combat never does. The farther one moved from the planning tables and closer to the tail of a bomber under attack, the clearer the flaw became. But those closest to the danger had the least authority to change anything. Orders flowed downward. Feedback rarely flowed up. And so the same mistakes repeated themselves, mission after mission. By late summer, the evidence was undeniable. Statistical analyses showed that defensive fire was failing to deter attacks. Hit rates were abysmally low. The sheer volume of ammunition expended bore no relationship to the number of enemy aircraft destroyed. Yet Training Command continued to insist that the solution was better discipline, not different thinking. Shoot only at the correct range. Fire controlled bursts. Trust the doctrine. The men who wrote those words had never watched a fighter tear through a formation at closing speeds that made calculation meaningless. They had never felt the helplessness of waiting while being targeted. The system asked gunners to behave like machines, executing procedures under conditions that made precision impossible. And when those procedures failed, the system blamed the gunners. This was the environment in which a quiet, unnoticed shift began. Not in headquarters, not in doctrine manuals, but inside a single bomber, in the hands of someone who had nothing invested in protecting the system. Someone young enough not to be fully absorbed by it. Someone unimportant enough to be ignored. Someone close enough to death to question everything. The official explanation for the losses was that war was costly. The unofficial truth was that the rules were killing the people who followed them. And sooner or later, someone was going to stop waiting. The people closest to a problem are often the last ones anyone listens to. Inside the bomber force, authority flowed in one direction. Orders came from instructors, analysts, and officers who trusted charts more than experience. Gunners were expected to execute, not question. To survive, you followed the rules. To be heard, you needed rank. The tail gunner had neither. He was young enough that older crewmen called him the kid, even though he was already in his 20s. He was small, underweight, and physically unimposing. He did not look like the kind of man whose ideas would change anything. And he had no credentials that mattered inside a military system built on hierarchy. He was not an engineer, not an officer, not a tactician trained in doctrine. He was just the man sitting alone at the back of the aircraft, watching fighters approach from behind. That position mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. The tail gunner saw every attack develop from its earliest moments. He watched fighters assemble at distance. He watched them align, accelerate, and commit. While other gunners focused on short windows of fire, the tail gunner saw the entire sequence unfold. And over time, patterns became impossible to ignore. The fighters always arrived with confidence. They flew as if they knew exactly when the defensive fire would begin. They stabilized calmly, lined up their shots, and fired first. When defensive guns finally opened up, it was already too late to matter. The manuals insisted this was the optimal exchange. Reality suggested otherwise. The kid noticed something else. The doctrine assumed that accuracy was everything, that hitting the enemy was the only objective that mattered. But in the chaos of combat, very few rounds ever struck their targets anyway. Precision was a luxury no one actually had. What mattered was control. Who dictated the rhythm of the fight? Who forced the other side to react? In every engagement, the attackers held that power. They chose when to approach, when to fire, and when to disengage. The bombers responded, always late, always under pressure. Waiting was not neutral. Waiting was surrendering initiative. This was not a conclusion drawn from theory. It came from watching bombers die while following the rules perfectly. The kid did what people without authority often do. He tested his thinking quietly. He did not announce his doubts. He did not challenge instructors. He simply paid attention. Between missions, he replayed engagements in his head. Not the hits, but the moments before them. The hesitation, the flinch, the break in formation, the sudden loss of confidence when something unexpected happened. He began to suspect that the goal of defensive fire was misunderstood. What if the point wasn't to hit the fighter at all? What if the point was to make the fighter pilot hesitate? Just long enough to ruin the attack. At long range, accuracy was poor. Everyone knew that. But at long range, something else happened. Pilots reacted. Tracers appeared earlier than expected. Streams of fire crossed their approach paths before they were ready. Their timing broke down. Their formations loosened. Their confidence eroded. None of that appeared in the manuals. The manuals were written by people who measured success in hit percentages and ammunition conservation. They did not measure fear. They did not measure hesitation. They did not measure disrupted plans. The kid was not trying to prove anyone wrong. He was trying to stay alive. That difference mattered. The bomber force did not reward initiative at the lowest levels. Deviating from doctrine was not innovation. It was disobedience. Wasting ammunition was grounds for discipline. Firing outside prescribed ranges was considered reckless. If the kid was wrong, the consequences would be immediate and personal. If he was right, no one would believe him. That was the paradox. He carried this realization with him on each mission, watching the same pattern repeat. Fighters formed up. Bombers waited. Men died. Eventually, the choice stopped being theoretical. At some point, the cost of following the rules became greater than the risk of breaking them. The kid understood that once he crossed that line, there would be no easy way back. Success would look like luck. Failure would look like proof that the doctrine was right all along. There would be no medals for questioning procedure, no praise for firing early. Only consequences. And yet, the alternative was continuing to do something he knew was not working. That is how change usually begins in rigid systems, not with permission, but with refusal. Not loud rebellion, but quiet defiance. The manuals said to wait. The kid decided he wouldn't. The moment that changes everything rarely feels heroic when it happens. There was no dramatic announcement, no declaration of rebellion, just a quiet decision made inside a cramped tail position thousands of feet above hostile territory. The rules were clear. Wait. Measure. Fire only when permitted. The kid did none of that. As enemy fighters began forming up behind the bomber stream, he did something every manual warned against. He opened fire early, much earlier than he was supposed to. Not because he believed he could hit them at that distance, but because he believed something else mattered more. Control. The first bursts reached out across empty sky long before the fighters were ready to attack. Tracers arced past them, not as precise strikes, but as warnings, unexpected, intrusive, disruptive. The effect was immediate. German pilots who expected a calm approach suddenly found themselves flying through fire. Their attack runs lost rhythm. Formations loosened. Pilots broke off to reset, to reassess, to try again. And when they tried again, the fire was still there. This was not marksmanship. It was pressure. The manuals treated aerial combat as a geometry problem. Angles, speeds, distances, lead times. The kid treated it as a human problem. Pilots were not machines. They reacted, they flinched, they hesitated. By firing early, the kid denied them the clean, controlled approach they needed. He forced them to react before they were ready. Instead of executing a planned attack, they were now responding to a threat. That shift changed everything. When the fighters finally closed to the ranges the doctrine preferred, they were no longer attacking a stable target. They were entering chaos. Their angles were off. Their timing was broken. Their confidence was already shaken. That was when the real damage happened. At closer range, accuracy mattered again, but now the conditions favored the defender. The fighters flew through continuous streams of fire instead of brief bursts. Their escape windows narrowed. Mistakes became fatal. The kid fired longer bursts than recommended. He ignored warnings about overheating and ammunition conservation. He did not pause to count rounds or adjust doctrine. He stayed on the trigger until the threat disappeared. To observers, it looked reckless. To the fighters facing him, it felt suffocating. The bomber's intercom crackled with confusion. Other gunners questioned what they were seeing. Some muttered that he was wasting ammunition. Others assumed panic had set in. But the sky behind the formation told a different story. Attacks stalled. Breakoffs came sooner. Fighters disengaged without completing their runs, and when they tried again, fewer returned. The kid was not trying to win a duel. He was trying to deny the enemy the conditions they needed to fight effectively. In doing so, he inverted the entire engagement. The bomber was no longer waiting to be attacked. The attacker was now reacting to the bomber. That reversal came at a cost. Enemy fire did not stop simply because the defenders changed tactics. Cannon shells tore through the tail section. Shrapnel ripped into aluminum and flesh alike. Oxygen lines shattered. One of the guns jammed under sustained fire. The manuals said to disengage under those conditions. The kid did not. He cleared the jam with numb fingers. He fought through narrowing vision as oxygen deprivation set in. He stayed at his position, even as pain and disorientation threatened to overwhelm him. Not out of bravado, out of necessity. Breaking the rule had committed him fully. Stopping now would have meant reverting to a system he already knew was deadly. When the attackers finally disengaged, the sky behind the bomber was empty. The bomber itself was barely intact. The tail section was shredded. The kid was wounded, exhausted, and barely conscious. He had fired far more ammunition than doctrine allowed. He had violated nearly every principle taught in training. And yet, the bomber was still flying. More than that, Enemy aircraft had gone down. Not one, not two, but several. For the first time, the result contradicted the rules. When the aircraft limped home, the aftermath was uncomfortable. Damage reports were grim. Medical teams treated wounds and oxygen deprivation. Ammunition tallies raised eyebrows. Then came the debrief. Claims of multiple enemy aircraft destroyed by a single bomber gunner sounded implausible. Bomber gunners were not supposed to achieve results like that. Fighter pilots did, not tail gunners. Skepticism filled the room. Luck, some suggested. Confusion, others implied. Overclaiming, perhaps. But there were witnesses. Other crews had seen aircraft break apart. Gun camera footage showed impacts. The evidence refused to disappear. What unsettled the officers most was not the number of enemy losses. It was how they had happened. The kids' method made no sense according to doctrine. It violated the math. It ignored established principles. It wasted resources. It should not have worked. And yet, it had. That was the danger. If the kid was right, the system was wrong. And systems do not like being wrong. Breaking the rule had solved a tactical problem, but it had created a political one. The question was no longer whether the tactic worked in one instance. The question was whether the institution was willing to admit that a teenager with no authority had discovered something the experts had missed. The sky had already answered. Now, the system would have to decide whether it was listening. Winning a fight does not mean you are forgiven for how you won it. When the bomber crews returned, the physical evidence was impossible to ignore. Aircraft damage was severe. Ammunition expenditure was far beyond regulation. Medical reports documented wounds consistent with sustained combat, not panic. But inside the system, results were not evaluated first. Procedure was. The kids' actions triggered alarms long before they earned praise. Training officers focused on what he had done wrong. He had fired outside authorized range. He had ignored burst limits. He had violated every principle designed to conserve ammunition and protect equipment. If his method were adopted widely, they argued, it would lead to chaos. Empty magazines, overheated guns, and undisciplined crews spraying the sky. From their perspective, the danger was obvious. If one gunner was allowed to ignore doctrine, others might follow. And if others followed without his instincts or restraint, the consequences could be disastrous. The system had a name for that scenario: breakdown of discipline. Inside briefing rooms, far from the sound of engines and gunfire, the explanation formed quickly. The kid had gotten lucky. Enemy pilots had made mistakes. The engagement was an anomaly, not a lesson. Anomalies did not require change. They required containment. What unsettled the training command was not the kid's lack of rank. It was the implication of his success. Accepting his method meant admitting that the carefully constructed doctrine taught to hundreds of thousands of men was fundamentally flawed. That kind of admission carries a cost no institution willingly pays. The debate intensified as reports filtered in. Squadron commanders who had lost crews were less interested in theory. They had seen the numbers. They understood what survival looked like. To them, the question was brutally simple. If following the rules produced losses and breaking them produced survivors, what exactly was being protected? That question was never written in official memoranda. It existed in tense conversations and closed-door meetings. Voices rose. Respectful language barely concealed anger. One side defended training. The other defended lives. The kid remained at the center of the argument without being present for most of it. He did not testify before committees. He did not argue his case. He simply returned to duty when cleared and continued flying. That silence worked against him. Without a champion, his actions could be dismissed as reckless behavior from someone who did not understand the bigger picture. It was easier to blame an individual than to challenge a doctrine. But the operational commanders pushed back. They pointed to loss rates that refused to improve under existing rules. They pointed to gun camera footage that contradicted theoretical expectations. They pointed to crews who came home because something different had happened. Statistics entered the conversation, not as abstractions, but as evidence. Numbers do not care about rank. If a tactic reduced losses, it mattered. If it disrupted enemy attacks, it mattered. The debate stopped being philosophical and became empirical. That shift forced senior leadership to intervene. At the highest level, the decision was not framed as right versus wrong. It was framed as risk versus risk. Continuing the current doctrine carried a known cost: steady losses that threatened the sustainability of the bomber campaign. Changing the doctrine carried uncertainty. What if widespread early fire caused new problems? The answer was not immediate endorsement. It was testing. The kid's method would not be punished, but it would not be officially approved either. Instead, it would be observed. Carefully. Quietly. Without altering doctrine on paper. He was instructed to explain what he did, not why it worked. That distinction mattered. The system could tolerate a technique. It could not tolerate a challenge to its authority. What followed was not a dramatic reversal, but a slow erosion of certainty. As more gunners experimented, similar patterns emerged. Enemy fighters approached differently. Attacks became less coordinated. Breakoffs happened earlier. Loss reports began to change. No announcement marked the moment when skepticism gave way to acceptance. Institutions rarely admit error out loud. They adjust language instead. Guidelines softened. Exceptions appeared. Phrases like, "when tactically appropriate," entered official recommendations. Doctrine did not change overnight. Reality did. The kid was never formally credited with rewriting the rules. He was tolerated, then quietly imitated. His method spread not because it was endorsed, but because it worked. In the end, he was neither punished nor celebrated. He was absorbed. The system moved forward as if the change had been inevitable all along. The manuals caught up, the language shifted, and the argument faded, not because it was resolved, but because the evidence had won. The most dangerous moment for any institution is not when it faces an enemy. It is when it faces the truth. And in this case, the truth had come from someone the system never intended to listen to. Institutions can ignore opinions. They can dismiss anecdotes. They can bury uncomfortable stories. They cannot ignore patterns. As the months passed, the evidence became harder to contain. The kid's method did not remain an isolated incident. Other gunners began experimenting, not out of rebellion, but out of desperation. They had watched too many friends disappear while doing everything correctly. They tried something different, and when they did, the sky responded. Enemy fighters still attacked, but their behavior changed. Approaches became cautious. Breakoffs happened sooner. Attack runs grew less precise. Pilots aborted engagements they would have pressed earlier in the year. This was not speculation. It showed up in reports. Intelligence officers began noticing correlations they could not explain away. Bomber formations that employed more aggressive defensive fire experienced fewer successful fighter attacks. Damage patterns shifted. Survival rates improved. At first, the changes were subtle. Then they weren't. Loss rates that had hovered at catastrophic levels began to fall. Not to zero, not to safety, but enough to matter. Enough to save lives. The significance of that shift cannot be overstated. Strategic bombing depended on continuity. Crews needed to survive long enough to gain experience. Veterans mattered more than replacements. Every aircraft that returned intact preserved hard-won skill. For the first time in months, the mathematics began to favor survival. Training Command resisted drawing conclusions too quickly. Correlation did not equal causation, they argued. Other variables were changing. Enemy pilots were becoming cautious. Escort coverage was improving. Weather patterns varied. All of that was true. But none of it explained the consistency. Across different units, at different times, under different conditions, the same pattern appeared. Earlier defensive fire disrupted attacks before they fully developed. Fighters reacted instead of executing. The attacker's initiative eroded. Psychology entered the analysis. Enemy pilots were not suicidal. They calculated risk. When the cost of an attack increased, even slightly, behavior changed. New pilots hesitated. Veterans grew conservative. Aggression softened. This effect compounded over time. A doctrine built on precision had underestimated uncertainty. A doctrine built on efficiency had ignored fear. The kids' approach had accidentally revealed something fundamental. Disrupting an enemy's plan could be as effective as destroying him outright. Eventually, the evidence forced a response. Official language shifted carefully. No one declared the old doctrine wrong. Instead, new phrasing appeared. Gunners were authorized to engage earlier when tactically appropriate. Commanders were encouraged to evaluate defensive fire holistically rather than strictly by ammunition usage. It was a face-saving evolution. Behind the language, practice changed. The kid continued flying, now less alone in his methods. He was no longer a problem to be corrected. He had become a data point the system quietly depended on. Mission after mission reinforced the trend. Enemy fighters adapted, but adaptation favored the defenders. The window of vulnerability narrowed. Losses declined. Crews noticed the difference immediately. They talked about it quietly. They started coming home. The kid's personal tally grew, but the number mattered less than the collective outcome. He was not the only one scoring victories anymore. Others using similar techniques began reporting successes of their own. What had once seemed reckless now appeared inevitable. By late 1943, the bomber force was not safe, but it was no longer bleeding uncontrollably. Survivability improved just enough to sustain the campaign until long-range fighter escorts could assume a greater role. The timing mattered. Had the losses continued at earlier rates, the bomber offensive might have collapsed under its own weight. Morale would have broken. Crews would have refused missions. Strategy would have been rewritten under duress. Instead, the system adapted, quietly, reluctantly, and without ceremony. The kids' contribution did not come with speeches or headlines. It arrived in reduced casualty lists, in fewer telegrams sent to families, in aircraft that limped home instead of vanishing. By the time official studies were conducted after the war, the conclusion was unavoidable. Formations that employed aggressive, early defensive fire suffered significantly fewer losses than those that adhered strictly to earlier doctrine. The effect persisted even when hit probabilities remained low. In military language, that meant something profound. The outcome of a battle was not determined solely by firepower or precision, but by who controlled the tempo of the engagement. The kid had figured that out without theory. He had learned it by watching people die. In the end, the system did not reward him with authority. It absorbed his idea and moved on. That is how large organizations survive uncomfortable truths, by incorporating them without acknowledgement. But the consequences of that quiet change echoed far beyond one bomber group. Hundreds of men lived long enough to finish their tours. Hundreds more returned to families who would never know how close they came to loss. The war continued, but it continued with fewer empty seats at briefing tables. Reality had won, not because it argued better, but because it kept producing results. And once results become measurable, doctrine has no choice but to follow. By the time the war began to turn decisively in the Allies' favor, the kid's moment had already passed. Air superiority arrived in stages. Long-range fighter escorts pushed deeper into enemy territory. German resistance weakened. The skies grew less contested. The brutal conditions that had made bomber gunners desperate innovators began to fade. There would be no second act of glory. The window in which one man's decision could alter survival rates closed quietly, just as it had opened. The kid completed his missions and rotated home. There were no victory parades waiting for him, no effort to turn his story into propaganda. The system had taken what it needed and moved on. That suited him. He declined opportunities for publicity. He did not lecture at academies or write memoirs. When the war ended, he returned to civilian life as anonymously as he had entered combat. To his family, he was simply a man who had done his duty. To his neighbors, just another veteran among millions. The medals went into drawers. The stories stayed mostly untold. And yet, the idea, he discovered, did not disappear. It traveled quietly through doctrine revisions and training updates. New gunners learned to engage threats earlier, to disrupt rather than wait, to think in terms of tempo instead of perfection. They never learned the name of the person who first broke the rule. They didn't need to. The principle mattered more than the person. As military technology advanced, the logic remained intact. In jet-age air combat, in missile defense systems, and in modern integrated air defenses, the same idea reappeared under different names. Engage early. Force reaction. Deny the attacker control. What began as an instinctive response to chaos became a foundational concept of modern defense. Not because it was elegant, but because it acknowledged human behavior under pressure. War is fought by people, not equations. The official records eventually caught up. Post-war studies confirmed what crews had already known. Units that disrupted attacks early suffered fewer losses. Psychological pressure mattered independently of accuracy. Fear altered outcomes as reliably as firepower. In technical language, the kid had been right. In human terms, that meant something simpler. Men came home who otherwise would not have. Years later, when obituaries mentioned his service, they did so briefly. Rank, medals, dates. Nothing about doctrine, nothing about innovation, nothing about the lives indirectly saved. That omission was not malicious. It was ordinary. History often remembers generals and machines. It forgets the quiet moments where someone close to death notices that the rules no longer make sense. The kid never claimed to be a hero. He never argued that he had changed the war. He only knew that waiting had been getting people killed, and that doing something, anything different was better than doing nothing at all. That kind of courage rarely looks dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It simply acts and then steps aside. Somewhere in the statistics of the air war, his decision is still visible. In the reduced loss rates, in the crews that finished their tours, in the families that never received a telegram. Those men never knew his name, but they lived because he trusted what he saw instead of what he was told. And sometimes that is how wars are changed, not by orders from above, but by a single person at the edge of the system who refuses to wait while the rules get people killed. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be remembered, please like the video and share it. Every share helps keep the real history alive and helps more people discover the men whose names were never meant to be famous.